next session. So, without further ado, let me just introduce our first speaker, if we may, Robert Dahl here to my right, a former Commissioner of New York City Human Resources Administration, appointed by Michael Bloomberg in 2007, and he was responsible for placing over 75,000 recipients of benefits into jobs each year and expanded the access to work support programs like food stamps and the earned income tax credit. Food stamps not necessarily a program that we're familiar with here, but earned income tax credit, very, very familiar, I suspect, to a number of initiatives here. He has an enormously distinguished career in journalism before he took up his career as a doer rather than a writer. I will not mention, because apparently we're not supposed to, that he did spend some time in the bank. That's apparently not part of our introduction to speakers. Robert, but I doubt that you'll survive it even if I do.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and it's been a great pleasure to be here this week. Thank you to the Policy Exchange and the Manhattan Institute and you for inviting me. I do have to say, as part of sort of keeping the tradition and commenting on the introductions, I can't say that my career in journalism was distinguished. I was a community newspaper editor in a small upstate New York community. I covered Little League baseball and small town hall meetings and had a lot of fun at it, but I can't say it was distinguished. I met my wife there, which was very good. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we did in New York with regard to welfare reform. I'm going to talk a little bit of how we did it, and then at the end I'd like to talk about the results. But before I do that, I want to just give a little bit of background, a little further background about my own personal experience. I grew up in a family of, my father was in government service. He was in the Justice Department of the United States government during the Civil Rights years. And he worked in the Civil Rights Division. He was the head of the Civil Rights Division for most of the really crucial period in the 1960s. And then after that period of time was over, he was asked by Robert Kennedy to come to New York to work in really one of the worst slums in America at the time, Bedford-Stuyvesant, which is a large neighborhood in central Brooklyn, about the size of the city of Pittsburgh. So largely black and Hispanic community, very poor, very welfare dependent, and going in the wrong direction in 1969 when that happened. And I was about 8 then, and so we'd come from this wonderful experience with the Civil Rights Movement and all that had changed in America there, where my father really had achieved maybe even heroic status, certainly distinguished status. And then we came to Brooklyn, and he was asked to start a small sort of business development, economic development program in the heart of Bedford-Stuyvesant, focusing on self-reliance and community renewal. And over the next 7 years of the 1970s, I saw, as a young person, a couple thousand people benefit from that program. Maybe a couple blocks got a little better. Supermarket moved in. Chemical bank opened a branch. And during that same time, this small improvement to a very, very troubled neighborhood was taking place, hundreds of thousands of people were being taken into and sucked into the entitlement society of our old welfare program in New York City. And really at the end of that period, my father's career in that period, no real significant change had taken place in Bedford-Stuyvesant, except it may have gotten worse, partly due to the policies of the overriding government. And I was reminded of that a little bit earlier today when the slide that showed Jimmy Carter in the South Bronx in New York City in the early 70s, and President Ford saying to the city, "Drop dead." We were about as low as you could be in the city of New York back then. And part of the problem was an entitlement focus on welfare dependency. It doesn't matter what you did, what mattered was your right to receive a certain benefit. And that was, in my opinion, extremely debilitating to communities. So it took a while for the United States to step up to that, and under President Clinton and Republican governors and others, federal legislation was passed. And when I was in government and had a chance to do something about these issues, I had the great fortune to be a bureaucrat, and I greatly appreciated the kind words you said about public servants at this session today. Right at the beginning of welfare reform in the United States. I was working for Governor Pataki in the state of New York in 1995. The welfare reform bill passed in 1996. And with Mayor Giuliani and George Pataki and what was happening in Washington, we dramatically changed welfare. We turned it around. And the most important thing we did, and I'm just going to stress the keys, the most important thing we did was we focused on personal responsibility. The entitlement to welfare was ended, and the contract between the state and the citizen was about a reciprocal responsibility. If we are going to provide you assistance, you need to do something first. Now, I have to say that can sometimes sound harsh and kind of unfeeling. But as a bureaucrat, and as someone who worked in government programs that were supposed to help people, the very first thing you learn after any real extended period of time is you can't help someone if you take all the responsibility for their future. You can help someone if they recognize that their actions are essential. I didn't say the only thing you needed, but an essential first step. So the messaging of government about personal responsibility was very strong and very important. We also required work. So in return for certain forms of assistance, you had to work, and if you didn't work, you were sanctioned. And that was, in New York City, a very liberal place, that was kind of dramatic to say that we're going to have consequences for failing to comply. But we did it, and we did it in a significant way, and we've done it for a long time, and the political consensus has remained in place. We also were going to focus on outcomes. We're not going to focus on process or how much money was spent. We're going to focus on how many jobs did we get, how much employment went up, how many jobs did our providers, Peter Cove was a provider, get people, and we were only going to pay for jobs. We weren't going to pay for budgets or staff. We were going to pay $1,000 for a 30-day placement in employment. We're going to pay $1,500 if they stayed 60 days. That may not be the exact numbers, but that's what it was. And if they didn't succeed, they didn't get paid. And then, now, those are sort of the harsh welfare reform type things. But the other thing we did was we vastly increased the return for low-wage work by shoring up low wages with work supports. This is something that's often completely ignored in any discussion of minimum wage legislation. Not all of, but the vast majority of people who have families and are working in low-wage jobs in New York City also get a supplement to those wages in the form of an earned income tax credit, food assistance or food voucher, housing assistance, child care assistance, child support enforcement collections. So the return for work was greatly improved. Now, the return for welfare and no work was frozen. Grant levels never rose, and the purchase power of those grant levels shrunk over these years, which I think was good. Work was always better. Better financially, better for your families, better for your communities. So we shored up work supports, and so for those of the Republican in America who don't like any form of dependency, caseloads rising and earned income tax credit spending made them a little uncomfortable. But for the vast majority of Americans, they want to help people who work. They're not so much interested in helping people who refuse to take on that first step up the economic ladder. The other thing we did, and this is so prosaic, it's almost silly to say, but it's important in the context of New York City, especially under Mayor Bloomberg. Social services bureaucrats and social services executives often are a little bit ambivalent about the other parts of government. Sometimes they just don't participate, they don't talk to them, they're focused on their worlds. Sometimes they worry that it's a competition for revenue and they'll take theirs, or maybe the people that want to reduce taxes make them nervous because less taxes means less dollars for what we're trying to fund. In our city under Michael Bloomberg, everybody was focused on job creation and job production and increasing and improving the economy. I can remember George Fatigue, who was the head of tourism. New York City has had every year for the last 7 years, year over year, great increases in the number of tourists coming to New York. And I ran into him one time early in the Bloomberg administration when I was working there, and I told him how happy I was about that. That's great, keep it up. And he looked at me like, why does the welfare guy, why is he asking? I mean, it seems you all probably know why I would say that, but it looked like he was sort of not yet quite getting it. And I said, every increase in tourism is more jobs for my people. More entry-level jobs, more jobs in hospitality, more jobs in retail. And I will say that we don't make apologies in the Bloomberg administration for entry-level jobs or jobs with wages of between $8 and $10. The minimum wage is $7.50 in the United States, in New York. Not because we don't want people to have better jobs, but because a job with the economic supports that go along with wages make livelihood a lot better for New Yorkers, and there is a step up, and any job is better than no job. So building and construction, healthcare, tourism, education, every opportunity we had to increase the economy, we were supportive. Finally, the other thing that we talked about, and this we didn't do so well, and this I noticed hasn't come up at all in this conference. Not that we've talked a lot about struggling New Yorkers. We have talked about people in cities that are struggling, and that is family. At the very end of the Bloomberg administration, Mayor Bloomberg decided that he was kind of tired of the discussions concerning the likelihood for success for young people, completely leaving out the role of two involved parents in children's lives. And that he felt that there ought to be some discussion, at least in an open, factual way, about the percentage differences between third grade reading tests and graduation rates and criminal justice involvement between children raised in single-parent families versus children raised in two-parent families. Not to lecture, not to impose his culture on someone, but just to be honest. And so we did a public service campaign with posters and raised those issues in a pretty stark way using the photographs of babies to make our point that these statistics, these facts, which Daniel Patrick Moynihan and others have talked about for a long time, ought to at least be known among teenagers, among young people. They ought to know that these statistics are out there and that they are troubling and difficult, and that government, as hard as it has tried, I heard the Lord today at lunch, enormous amounts of money we spend and the very limited amount of success we've had. It's not because we haven't found the right solution, it's because in some areas there are limitations of what government can accomplish all by itself. So during that time, labor force participation for never married mothers rose from 43% to 63% in New York City. That happened around the country as a result of welfare reform, and it was unprecedented. Welfare programs had been in place for years, and nowhere had there been that kind of increase in workforce participation. The number of people on cash welfare, I usually start with this, I forgot to mention it, which in 1994 was 1.1 million. When we left, it was at 347,000. That's a very dramatic. I don't know many other government charts that are that dramatic in the right direction, in our judgment. In addition, poverty rates dropped. African American poverty rates in America, in the wake of welfare reform, reached their lowest point, child poverty rates ever. And in New York City, they dropped very significantly from 40% to 31%, and have remained low, although they've not gone much further down in the wake of the recession. Material deprivation eased. Any measurement, and one of the things about the poverty measure in the United States that everyone who studied it knows, is that it measures income, and it only really measures market income. It doesn't count the transfer of benefits that come into people's households, and so it also doesn't really measure their purchasing power. And in many, many ways, low-income New Yorkers, material deprivation was shrunk, and their ability to purchase the things they need in their daily lives was sustained, with the exception of housing, which was a significant shortcoming. So all of that led to what is what we did in New York, and those are the results. I think, again, it was a focus on personal responsibility, it was a focus on work, but it was not being afraid to shore up low wages with work supports. And just, I can hear all of you thinking, well, that's all very nice, but how did Mayor de Blasio get elected? If all that's true, how did that happen? And I won't get into that too long, except to say the 20-year center-right leadership in New York City, from Mayor Giuliani through Mayor Bloomberg, that's the tide being in a long time. And in politics, there is an ebb and flow. I mean, there's a writer in America who likes to always say, the outs will always be in, and the ins will always be out, eventually. In addition, Mayor Bloomberg, at the end of 3 terms, everybody gets a little tired of the old hat, and you have to be honest about that. There was a prickliness to his personality. And the Democratic Party primary caused other issues as well. And we'll just see how the big shift that is taking place in New York works out. But I do think that any increase in entitlement that's not tied to employment will not reduce poverty. And I don't think it'll solve the housing crisis either. So with that, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks.
Indeed, Robert. You know, it's interesting that we don't have term limits in this country, and part of the argumentation is we don't need them because the sell-by date, the politicians will secure their removal in due course. sooner or later, generally sooner. Our next speaker is James Bartholomew. I'm delighted, James, that you're able to make it here with us. James, of course, is famously the author of The Welfare State We're In, which is about the British welfare state, and he argues in that book that it's done considerable damage to British society. He originally trained as a banker. That's third person who's had some experience in a bank. Never mind, it's a stigma. This is a good free market organisation. Worked with the Financial Times, underlining his financial criteria. Then the Far Eastern Economic Review. He's written a column for the Daily Telegraph. God knows, you're painted us so far to the right, I can practically not see you. James, on investment more than 13 years. He's a fellow of the Institute of Economic Affairs and a fellow of the Adam Smith Institute. The welfare state we're in was the winner in the Institute of Economic Affairs Arthur Selden Award for excellence. He also won the 2007 Sir Anthony Fisher Memorial Award, which is awarded by the Atlas Foundation in America. The reality is that the welfare state we're in remains one of the most significant polemics on the issue of welfare reform and welfare consequences that we've seen in this country since the war. So it's a huge pleasure to welcome our next speaker, James Bartholomew. James.
That's my favourite introduction. I like to record that every time I speak. Well, as you say very kindly, this book was about the British welfare state and argued that the welfare state had done a lot of harm. In fact, we'd have been better off if it had never been created, the modern welfare state, I'm talking since 1870, 1900 sometime. But after I wrote that and talked about it, a lot of people at functions like this would say, okay, so what would you do about it? In fact, one of them was Maggie Thatcher. He said, okay, what will you do? Come on. I was treated like a junior minister. And so I've been researching a lot into this subject, and I have visited a lot of countries, certainly 11 at least, and I've also read about other countries, trying to look for models of better ways to run a welfare state. In fact, one of the people in Sweden said to me, in Sweden we've had a compromise. The right has agreed to have a welfare state, and the left has agreed to make it work. And that is the compromise which I think the world is heading towards, if it's got, I think, not very elegantly or directly, but I think they'll bumble their way in that direction. And then I looked around at these different countries, and I found two countries which seemed to me to have better welfare states than the others, because all advanced countries have a welfare state. There's a great British illusion that we're the only people with a welfare state. Actually, there is no advanced democracy which does not have a welfare state, certainly including the United States. So, the two countries I came across, which I thought were doing things better than average, I'm not saying they're perfect by any means, were Singapore and Switzerland. Now, these two countries have one thing in common and one thing that's very different. The thing they have in common is that they are small units. Singapore has a smaller population than London. Switzerland is very much divided into cantons, which have a lot of autonomy, and also then subdivided into communes, which also have some power. And to give you an idea of just how devolved it is, there is no Minister of Education in Switzerland, with no visible harm to the educational standards of the country. So the thing they have in common is regionalisation, and I think that is important, and that size matters. Small size matters. And it particularly matters when it comes to welfare. Let's take White D. Those of you who are British may have heard of White D or seen the series. This was a character who appeared in a Channel 4 series of documentaries about her life on benefits. She is on welfare benefits, on incapacity benefits, or as it's got a new name now, but that's the simpler name. And it is effectively, she's saying that I am too depressed to work. We saw her week after week, not looking very depressed at all, appearing to manage more or less the street. She was known as White D as one of the mothers of the street. People would come to her, confide in her. She was one of the most intelligent, articulate, active, lively intelligences, and she became the star of the show, but she's too depressed to work. And she's now gone on various freebies, and if you read the popular papers, which I'm sure none of you do, you would have seen a great deal more about it. That's one of the problems with our papers, actually, is that the quality papers don't tell the people all the news that's fit to print. They ignore what's going on in welfare. Especially, it's a sort of noblesse oblige. We can't be rude about people on welfare benefits because we're upper middle class, highly educated, rather well paid, and it would look mean. So we will ignore what's going on in our country. We will pretend it's not happening. Meanwhile, those of us who also read the popular press will know that a lot's been happening to White D, and there will be some people in this country who, seeing the series, as they watched it, will have felt, that's really annoying. I'm working and she's not, and I don't think she deserves to be on these benefits. But most people will have thought, oh, does it really matter? You know, there's one person, maybe there's a case, I expect the authorities will look into it. They wouldn't really care very much. It's an amusement. It's almost like fiction, some of these reality shows. So, and most people, of course, will not have watched the show at all. They won't know about it or care about it. And you have that situation here in a country of over 60 million. If that person, in the old days in Britain, relief was given by the parish, in which there could be as few as 1,000 people. If White D was in the street next to you, and you were paying local taxes for her not to work, you might be a lot more interested in her case. You may ask questions more persistently. And that is part of the reason, not the only reason, why localisation of welfare and benefits matters, I believe. Some people thought that the programme, incidentally, was a deliberate victimisation by right-wing television makers to stigmatise those on benefits. I happen to know, through television contacts, that this is the very reverse of the truth. And the people concerned were left-wing and sympathetic, and it was completely unintentional on their part that it should come out the way it did. Now, the fact that this makes a difference is evidenced by what happens in Switzerland. What happens in Switzerland is you have different levels of democracy in different cantons. And the cantons which have the most democracy and the greatest, and have the right to have a referendum on any major spending proposal, those cantons have the lowest spending and the lowest taxes. That's because when people have the local chance to make a decision about it, they say, hang on, this is my money, I'm not so sure about this. Whereas where it's a great morass, this has been observed since the 19th century, the bigger the pot, the more people don't really care about it, don't feel it's their province. When it's local, it affects the mentality of the administrators, who feel they're more accountable, they're seen, they're known, and it affects the mentality of the benefit recipients. The other thing is very different between Singapore and Switzerland. That is the level of democracy. Switzerland, as I say, is a highly democratic place. You have regular referenda every year at the commune level, the canton level, and the national level. They've just had a referendum on the minimum wage, which they voted against. So this is a big contrast with Singapore, which, as those of you who know it will know, is technically a democracy, but where the same party's been in power for as long as I can remember. And if you oppose the government, you are likely to have a rough time, you might well be arrested. So we obviously don't want to go the Singapore route in terms of administration. And I put it to you, though, that having a fuller democracy, we've got a parliamentary democracy. It's been around since the 17th century. It is a model of democracy which has shown, especially with regard to welfare, it doesn't work well. Good decisions are not made. And I think that we should consider the effects of direct democracy. And so I would recommend as follows. Since I'm actually going to lay it on the line, I would recommend having a regional government of London and the surrounding areas. And we would have other regional governments in Britain. The benefits should be guidelines, as in Switzerland, on a cantonal level of how the benefits will be, what level they will be, how they will be decided. Guidelines. But more local areas, the communes would administer them and have a lot of decision making and would bear some of the cost. Bearing the cost is very important, or some of it. And while we're on the subject of regionalisation of welfare, it's also relevant to minimum wages. Minimum wages have been and indeed benefit levels, because when these have been synchronised across an entire country, they have been disastrous. That's because we've had the same level of benefits in London as in Glasgow and Merthyr Tydfil. We have had over 20% people claiming that they are incapable of working in Glasgow. And that's because the level of benefit in Glasgow is attractive, more attractive than it is in London. If we had a regional government, the Glasgow people would not be so stupid as to make an amount that was so tempting to people that they moved on to it when clearly they are not incapable of work. I know that housing has been discussed this morning, but I want to say something about housing because it is so relevant, especially to British welfare, where it is the elephant in the room. It has been, all the time that I've been looking at this, it's been the big thing that nobody's wanted to face. And what the big thing is this. House prices have risen and risen across the country, but obviously especially in places like London. As a result, the large amount of social housing that is at a discounted rate for people who don't have a job has created an unemployment trap where you are crazy if you take a job, because if you lose your housing benefit, you will be no better off than if you didn't work. And meanwhile, you can work on the side, which incidentally is very, very common, and the official government statistics on working on the side are ridiculous, absurd for anybody who's looked at the research on this. And they're quoted by the left the whole time, and they're totally wrong. So we've had disincentive to work from our housing. It's been much bigger and more dangerous in other countries such as Germany, where they have not had this rise in house prices, and also the social housing is a much smaller part of their housing. So what should we do about this? First, I think there should be a planning revolution in which whole areas of the country, but certainly of London, are rezoned and enabled so that councils and individuals are able to profit from completely redeveloping large areas. I mean, large parts of South London, which are impossible to get through and extremely ugly, I've lived there, could be redeveloped and made vastly better by a dramatic development. And the whole purpose of this, of course, in case it isn't obvious, is to bring down the cost of housing in relation to incomes, which is far too high. The second thing is we should minimise the social housing sector altogether. It doesn't make sense for reasons I could explain. And thirdly, insofar as we have social housing at all, it should be moved to the outskirts of towns, not in the most desirable, expensive places. It is inherently unfair and unjust that people work for a long time and are living next to people who are not working and living in prime areas. It is unjust. And fourth, like Maggie and like Singapore, I believe we should transfer as much as possible to private ownership. And Singapore has a scheme whereby you compulsorily have to put money into a scheme, a central provident fund, and it's divided into various ways. Some of it's for healthcare, which is not relevant to this, but some of it can be used either for pension or for housing. And most people use it for housing, and you will find the rate of house ownership in Singapore is streets ahead of anything we know in Europe, anything at all. And the result of that is everybody has a stake, as Lee Kuan Yew intended. Everybody has a stake. If you want to reduce inequality, which is the flavour of the moment, nothing could be more dramatically important than giving enabling everybody to own housing. We'd get rid of unemployment traps and give them a stake and be better for society altogether. In addition to all this, I mean, I've gone off on this because I think, A, you get a better system, B, it's more likely to last longer. We've had systems which have gone from one extreme to another. In Elizabethan times, people were branded for begging in the wrong parish. And then they were given lots of work, and there was a huge amount of lone parenting and unemployment, and working on the side. We've been through this before. I'm very conscious that we could do things all over again. We're going through a period at the moment when we're tightening down, but we could go through another period when everyone says, let's go for it. They've forgotten. Direct democracy and regionalisation is a way of, as Switzerland has shown, of trying to reduce that temptation, that likelihood. And so I think that's about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. That's, I think, what they call a challenging presentation. I'd be astonished if there weren't a few questions coming your way afterwards, James. But thank you very much indeed for that. Our third speaker is not Dr. Lee Bowes, as you probably worked out, but it is Dr. Lee Bowes' husband, Peter Cove. And as you know, Lee Bowes is the Chief Executive Officer of America Works. Well, as it happens, Peter was the founder of America Works, and whilst it's a matter of regret, we send your wife our best wishes, Peter, for her speedy recovery. I know she's not been terribly well, but we're delighted that you're here. It's marvellous that you are able to present the case. As you probably have gathered, America Works is, around a $15 million a year business. What Peter achieved, along with his wife, is essentially educating both political parties in the US about the merits of implementing a national work-first policy in the late 1970s, and it's grown from strength to strength since that time. It again is part of this conversation that we desperately need to have about the interaction between welfare and work. So, Peter, over to you.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. I appreciate your comments about my wife, who was not well last evening. I called her a few minutes ago and asked how she was, and she said she was getting better. And I said to her, Lee, in your wildest dreams, would you ever have expected that I would have been walking into this unbelievable mansion, this gorgeous, gorgeous place, and speaking in front of such an illustrious group of people? And she said to me, Peter, I don't want to break it to you, but you've never been in my wildest dreams. And I thought I was her trophy husband. I guess I am not. I want to thank you all for having me instead of my wife. I guess I want to say what Monty Python said often in their show, now for something completely different. What I'm going to throw out at you is completely different, I believe. I have not heard anyone propose what I'm going to suggest to you, and what I'm going to propose to you is part of a book, or is the basis of a book that will be published by Basic Books next February, I believe, which I've entitled Poor No More. And it comes from not academia, where many of the people who spoke this morning are from policy think tanks, although I have to thank the Manhattan Institute and Larry Mohn for having helped me develop some of these ideas and encourage me to go forward with them. These come from 50 years of working with poverty programs, and a realization that I had while I had a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to go to Bellagio and write about poverty and what happened over the 50 years in the United States. And I came to the realization, and it was a tough one, that we had really failed, that we had, and I was complicit. I was part of the war on poverty. It started in 64 and 65 in the United States, and continued on over all these years. And despite the success of America Works, placing over 400,000 people in jobs in the United States over this period of time, most of public policy around poverty has failed, and welfare as well has failed. And so I began to think, what might be a solution to this? And part of it came when I was reading a somewhat recent book by Charles Murray, who I respect tremendously. However, in this book, his solution to poverty, to welfare really was to give everybody $10,000 that year, each year. And everybody, regardless of their income or their state of poverty. And what struck me about that was there was no discussion of work. Work, for what I have seen, is, and we've heard this morning, this afternoon, work is what brings you out of poverty. Work is what gives you the independence. I remember as a Jew in 1984, 1964, no, this is the 84, Pope John's encyclical on work, and I read it. And it had such an effect on me because I had always thought of work as it gave you an identity, it gave you money, it supported your family. And he talked about the spirituality of work. And it never occurred to me that work had a spiritual value. He even had some line in there about if a state denies you work, they're denying you a chance for your spirituality. And I have always felt that work was the most important part of how you bring people out of poverty. And when I had this observation in Bellagio that we had not really placed work at the center, we had placed more welfare at the center, and even here was a libertarian, Charles Murray, suggesting more money going out for people who were poor and on welfare. And I thought, I have to think about this. I've failed, or rather, I've been part of what's failed in terms of poverty programs. I've been part of the welfare system in supporting much of that, and I need to figure out a better way. So here it comes. I've not presented this to any group before, but I have three things I believe we can do to completely change our system of helping poor people. The first, we should get rid of all welfare programs except for people who are mentally and physically unable to go to work. We should get rid of all welfare programs because all they're doing is supporting non-work. Second, we should get rid of most poverty programs because they don't work. I've been involved in them for 50 years. I'm not going to speak for the programs in Great Britain, but in the United States, most poverty programs don't work. You look at the research and you'll see it. If there are a few that work, let's keep them, but most of them don't work. So I get rid of welfare, except for people who mentally or physically could not go to work. I would get rid of poverty programs, except for the few that some research might show do work. And I would take all that money in the United States, it would be about $360 billion a year, and I would shift it to creation of jobs in the public and private sector, preferably the private sector. But ultimately, if we could not create enough jobs with that money, the shifting of that money, then in the private sector, we would then move it into public sector jobs. And by the way, I would certainly want to see much of that work devoted to infrastructure development. And we've talked a little bit about that this morning. And I'm not going to get into that in detail. I do in the book, but I'm not going to get into that in detail right now. Would there be enough money in the United States if you did exactly what I said? And the answer is not only would there be enough money, there'd be more than enough money. You'd have money left over. So if a young woman came to the government and said, I had a child and I'd like money from the government would say, no, we're not going to give you money, but we have a job and daycare for you. That's all built into the cost structure that we worked out. And if you want to take the job, then and it will be enough money to pay for the basics, clothing and shelter and food. And if you want to do that, there's a job for you. What we would be doing is taking America back to its roots, which was work. I had an interesting conversation with Paul Ryan, who, as most of you know, ran for vice president. He came into our offices about 6-8 weeks ago in Washington, and he went into a room of about 30 black women, all on welfare. And he was really good with them. It was very interesting. The conservative Republican, probably none of the people in that room were conservative. They probably mostly voted Democratic if they voted. And when he came out, I said to him, "What'd you learn?" And he said, "They really want to work, don't they, Peter?" And I said, "That's exactly what Rudy Giuliani said to me when he came into our offices in New York a year before he became mayor the first time." And I said, "The mistake that you and more Mitt Romney made when Mitt Romney talked, I don't know if most of you know about this, we talked about 47% of the people in the United States, as he was shaking their heads, are takers." I said, "The mistake you made wasn't a figure, or whether it's right or wrong, I don't know. I said, the mistake you made is you left the impression that all those people want to be takers." I said, as a conservative, what you should have been saying was the government was setting up the conditions so that people made the rational choice not to work. And I told him that the Obama administration had just come in last year while Robert was commissioner, about a year and a half ago, and this is now being implemented by the current administration in New York. And they told the city, the mayor, he could not require people on food stamps, that is, people who got help, financial help for food, could not require them to go to work, even though we are doing that with welfare recipients in the United States. And I said, that's the kind of thing that goes on. We set up the conditions where people will not work. It isn't that, sure, there are bums, and we see them coming through our offices every day, but the vast majority of people want to work. And Paul Ryan saw that, Rudy Giuliani saw that, certainly Mayor Bloomberg knew that. Our present president in the United States is more equivocal about that, as is our new mayor. This may surprise you. I was telling some people this yesterday. At America Works, we got a memo a week and a half ago from the de Blasio administration that told us that even voluntary people who are on food stamps, that are getting this help, even if they volunteered, we could not place them in jobs. And most of those people happen to be veterans. So they literally cut us out from placing people who were veterans. And you say, well, why would they do that? What would be? And the answer is a very progressive, in quotes, answer. We don't want people going into hamburger flipper jobs. We don't want people going into, as Robert talked about, $8 to $10 an hour jobs. We want people getting those kinds of jobs that really are going to give them a future. And what Robert and we know is that any job is a good job. Any job is better than being on the dole. And any job will move you to the next level. I started out as a paper boy. I don't know how anybody else. I know in the United States, approximately 10% of the working population worked for McDonald's first. So you start out someplace, and then you move up, and you use education and training to move the people up. But you have to be careful that you not set up policies, as our present mayor is doing, and as the president has done, where you try to have a progressive idea lead to a progressive solution. And as Steve Goldsmith said yesterday, and I quote him, I hope almost exactly, I don't think he's still here, but I quote him, progressive solutions, progressive governments do not provide progressive solutions. And I believe that very strongly as I've watched In Good Intentions. I want to call your attention to a book, which some of you may know or not, by David Stove, who was an Australian political philosopher. And the title of the book is What's Wrong with Benevolence? It's kind of an interesting title. And in it he talks about why when we try to do good, we often do not do good. And he goes back to Hume, to Kant, because but it's actually not a long book, and it's a wonderful exposition on why when we try to do good, and I see progressives trying to do that all the time, trying to do good, but you end up doing bad. I want to kind of end this up, and I hope some of you have questions regarding my proposal, but I want to say I don't think cities can any longer be the repositories of non-working, publicly dependent people. I think work must become a substitute for dole dependency. And I know that my proposals will not happen overnight, but what I'd like to see is that it steers the thinking about welfare policy so that we begin to think about work rather than welfare, and not just as well, you know, you have to go to work if you're getting welfare. I want to see us get rid of welfare. I want to see us have work, and I think we will become a much more humane society. Thank you very much.
Well, there's a nice three modest presentations, which I'm sure we can all agree on, and move on to the next topic. Any questions? And indeed comments. I've taken, if I can, from people who haven't asked questions before. Gentlemen over there on that side, then this lady here in the front. And we'll get a few more in. The gentleman is over there, please. Is that on?
Sure. Moving Hack from Trust for London. I think the problem with the debate is it's been highly polarised between those who don't work and those who work. And the reality is that most of people actually getting housing benefits and welfare benefits actually are in work. It's not either or. So I think there's a problem with the argument they have in the first place. The other issues around the growth of in-work poverty that we've seen over the last decade here in this country and in the States. And I just wanted to hear what your ideas were around in terms of combating the big growth in low pay. Because it's not just about what the state needs to do, it's about what employees need to do. And that seems to be missing from your argument and from the debate.
Well, let's just go along the line. Yes,
Okay. One of the things I maybe didn't stress is, and may not agree with the two other panelists, is that in order to have a work requirement and work support system, you have to have a bureaucracy to make it run. Of course, I'm a former bureaucrat defending my job. But the fact is that you're right, that a lot of people who receive benefits in the United States before we instituted welfare reform and even now, were working, and just as they are here but in order to sort of flush that out, you have to have them, if they're going to still seek benefits in addition to whatever it is they're earning, you have to have them come in and be somewhere. And what happens is that once they have to be somewhere, it turns out they had a job all along. And so I don't actually agree that all of welfare could be eliminated. I'm a big believer in shoring up low wages with additional supports. But in order to do that effectively, you have to really make contact with people and not make it, and actually have a case management function where people are coming in and you're saying, well, where are you going to be tomorrow and the next day and the day after that? And if you're not working, we need you to be at Peter's shop or someone's place doing something and engage in some activity. And when that happens, all of a sudden jobs do appear. And if those jobs aren't sufficient enough to afford the cost of living in that area, I think government supports can raise their standard of living further. That I don't have a problem with. But the idea that you don't have an apparatus to make sure there's that engagement, and you're just sort of trusting the client to do what he or she said she was going to do, it just doesn't work because people will make rational judgments about their time and their income. And if they can get over, which is an American expression for take advantage of the system, they will. And so that would be my take.
The only thing I would just add, just to pick up on the question, is that in this country, we have accepted the principle that we won't be abandoning the welfare state entirely, although I think we understand the sort of intellectual logic behind Peter and to some degree James's argument. But we do have a system that, for example, says that your entitlement to benefits should surely diminish as your income increases. Now that's a really sensible proposition, except that it means that in the hands of the recipient there comes a point at which there's no point in earning anymore because what you earn is simply then reducing the amount you receive from the state. So we are constantly in this position where, despite recent efforts, for example, the government recently introduced during the time of the coalition a thing called universal credit. which is the idea of trying to take all of these benefits and produce a system in which people are always better off in work. Now, the one thing that I think unifies all three speakers, if I get this correctly, and I think it's something that the whole audience here would go with, is that people are better in work for their spiritual health, their moral health, the health of their community, the health of their family, the health of their society. Nothing is worse than, you know, societies where 3-4 generations have been workless. And the damage that has on them and their communities, which, you know, James refers to. But how do you deal with that?
Yeah, I just want to say, I'm familiar with the universal credit issue and this marginal tax rate issue.
Yeah.
And my view is that I sometimes worry we're getting suckered by the left into increasing benefits further up the income level. Because the only way to really address that issue is you level it off and you make it go further up to $50,000 or $60,000. And all of a sudden, then you've got even more people dependent on the check. The fact is, if you are earning more money, then your benefit, that's the whole point, your benefit should be reduced. Not 1-for-1, but it should be reduced. And you have to have an apparatus that says that's what we want you to do, and once you achieve that level, benefits will be dried up. So it's complicated, but if you just end up trying to smooth it out, you'll end up you'll always extending the benefit to people who are further up the income ladder.
I just think that, first of all, I obviously am not suggesting to get rid of all welfare. I've suggested that there be welfare, let me put it in a positive sense, for people who mentally or physically are incapable of working. But I reject the notion that we should continue some form of equitable welfare distribution. I don't think it's necessary. I think if we create the jobs for people to go to work, then we'll know that they're going to work. And if they don't want to go to work, they can fare any way they wish to fare.
Yeah. James?
Well, I mean, there are so many issues that you raised that I won't cover all of them. I'd just like to point out, though, when people talk about the growth of low pay, which is a phrase that you used, that pay for the lowest paid has increased about 10 times in the last century. The low paid are vastly richer than the low paid a century ago. So there's been a growth, perhaps you could argue, statistically, growth in the number of people of low pay, but in terms of the lowness of pay of the poorest people, there's been a vast improvement. And on top of that, the cost of food has drastically declined. Drastically. Now compared with, it used to be 50% of the budget of poor people. Now it's gone down to below 20%. It's gone right down. The cost of clothing has gone right down. People were glad to have shoes at the beginning of the 20th century. The only thing that's gone really up is housing. Housing is the problem.
Yeah. Next question.
Good afternoon, Nicole Jelinek from the Manhattan Institute. A question for Peter. You said that rather than getting welfare, people could go to the state, get a job that would pay them enough money for clothing, shelter, and the basics. But who decides what is enough money? As Robert intimated, these benefits are worth a lot of money. A public housing apartment in New York, if you had to pay for it, that would be worth $25,000 a year alone. Healthcare for a family, food for a family, you're up to $25,000, $40,000 depending on your definition. Is there a concern then that if you get a government guaranteed job that pays this much, no one is going to work for a low-wage job? You are competing with, whether one wants a higher minimum wage or not, you're competing with and possibly distorting these lower-paid private sector jobs and indeed some middle-income jobs. Thank you.
Well,
Yes, Peter.
it is possible that there would be distortion, and that is something we're going to have to look at. The basic question you asked is, who would make those decisions? Well, who makes them now? Would they made politically and bureaucratically? And I would see it being made the same way. I'd see, but politically, you'd have to have, and I suggest in my book an authority, but we can talk about that would create those jobs and oversee them and decide on how much to pay for those jobs. But it could be something other than an authority. The distortion of the private market, I don't think will be significant. It wasn't significant in WPA, when we had, which was our public employment program during the Depression. And I've had conversations with people who are very familiar with the WPA. I've structured it in such a way so that it should not distort, but that is something we have to look at. I think you're absolutely right.
Want to add to that?
Well, the amazing thing about the New York experience is that we didn't have to create jobs because whatever was going on in New York in the late 90s and even right through the Great Recession, New York didn't really suffer that bad in the Great Recession for a lot of reasons. The turnover rate in the low-wage job sector was really quite remarkable. And I was never embarrassed by that because that was opportunities for people who were on dependent programs. And so I just think that Peter's very right to emphasize work, but I don't know that the government creating jobs is a better, more efficient way to create employment than doing what you need to do to get the private sector creating jobs.
Can I just say one thing on the private sector thing? The suggestion in my book and my proposals, there are a number of ways of creating those jobs, and they're not, Robert's right, the jobs were there for the welfare recipients who we wanted to place in jobs. But if you really started to talk about my proposal, I'm not sure all the jobs would be there. At America Works, we use something called wage supplementation, where we took money, basically government money, and gave it on a monthly basis to private companies to offset wages of people over a period of 3 to 6 months. And it worked. It was terrific. It worked beautifully. The companies hired people. They created 2 jobs often where they would have only created 1. So there are ways of doing that. I think Robert's right in terms of our experience, but if my proposals came to fruition, which would take a long time, but if they came to fruition, I'm not sure we wouldn't need this.
James?
I won't attempt to answer the question because these people know much more about it than I do, but I would add an anecdote. When I was in New York, I visited Harlem and the Lower East Side, and I went in taxis to get around, and I talked to one of the taxi drivers, and he said, yeah, you can get a place in Harlem, you just have to give some money under the table, and so there was another taxi driver, I asked about this, was this true? And he said, yeah, and they disagreed about the price, I think it was somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000 to get up the queue, but this is one of the many problems with social housing.
Absolutely. Next question.
Councillor Barry McCullough, currently Deputy Leader of Harrow Council until the new administration takes control next week from the elections. And that brings me to the point I'd like to ask, is actually how do you get the reforms to go through? Given you've got a political process that changes over time, that you do need to get some of these things in, and sometimes it can be radical, so it creates a constituency against that change. And so how do you actually create that call for further reform to move us? And also there's going to be people who are not just on welfare because they're choosing to be on welfare, they've chosen, particularly when it comes to pensions or long-term care, social care stuff, they've chosen it because that's the most rational thing to be on. They've made provision. They're in a stage of life they can't move to something else very easily, if at all. So how do you take them with you as well as reform the whole process?
So the big welfare reform in the United States concerned a relatively now small program, the Aid to Families with Dependent Children program, which was mostly for single mothers, which was a disaster in the early 90s. It was terrible. And that, I think, sort of, it could not get so bad. That led to the reform, the Republican governors in the states, and then President Clinton finally agreeing that it had to be done and calling for ending welfare as we know it, and the Republican Congress. So in some respects, things had to get so bad that it just led to people just throwing up their hands and saying, we can't. And intellectual development, the organization I work for, the American Enterprise Institute, others, Manhattan Institute, certainly scholars wrote about all this expenditure and no progress. So that helps when you have a disaster. And then getting a bipartisan agreement on it. And then success. Things got better. And that's why I'm quite proud of the fact that in liberal New York City, as blue a state as you could be, we really did not run into trouble on these issues of any real terrible significance. And even Mr. de Blasio's election didn't call question to welfare policy so much as he talked about inequality and housing, which are a little bit different. So that helped. And so but what I do think also is, I want to go back to the first thing I said about the Bedford side. It's a large community, the size of Pittsburgh, in the middle of Brooklyn. It's a place nobody went or wanted to go or invest in. It was really a struggling part of our city. It sounds a little bit like these other cities, and I don't want to overstate it, but I have to tell you, part of the reason no one wanted to go there is because no one worked there. And the people didn't, there wasn't a community of people getting up in the morning and going off to work. And I have a feeling, we always talk about crime reduction in New York, and we always talk about the economics getting better. But welfare dependency contributes to both of those, a weak economy and bad crime statistics. And I just think if you want to revitalize these cities, you have to make them working places. And if you have a very generous public benefit system that is encouraging people not to work, you're not going to change them.
I just wanted to say that we were involved before welfare reform with the Clinton White House and with Newt Gingrich as they were trying to structure something that would pass with both Republican and Democratic votes. And what we were able to contribute came because the public-private initiative, no, I'm sorry, I've got the wrong, it's PPI, that's part of the Democratic Leadership Conference in Washington. It's a think tank. And that think tank was able to bring what we knew about work first, that work first was better than education and training and other things, into the bill. And that came on the heels of the Manhattan Institute having supported Charles Murray in the definitive book on why welfare failed in the United States. I say these things because the way in which you develop change in the United States, I see it, one major way, is working through institutions like MI and others to influence policymakers and people who vote on these things. And I think you can do that. And they run conferences and other things, as you all know here. So I think that's one way of bringing about the change.
The keener-eyed among you will have noticed that we've just stepped past 4 o'clock. That's because Policy and Exchange, in its wisdom, has decided that if they give you tea, you'll all leave. And so what they've decided to do is swap the promise of boring tea with alcohol at the end of the programme. That seemed to me a hell of a deal, to be absolutely honest. So on that basis, we've got a few more minutes for questions before our next session begins.
Can I have one more thing?
Yes, of
Related
course.
to your last question, and I'm so glad you treated us better than the poor guy that sat here before. I meant that nicely. It was a good debate. But one other factor in changing welfare was evaluation and research. That did research on training education versus work first and found work first worked. And they did randomized assignment studies, and they carried the academic world, which also helped change the change. Sorry.
Yeah, not at all. No, I may have said I was only tough on our previous speaker, Henry, because I come out in hives when I hear economists talking about evidence.
Yes, I got it. So that's why I was nervous about bringing it up.
What they mean is prejudice. Yes.
Hi, James. I'm not clear on what you're advocating. Are you saying we should tackle the welfare and benefit systems first and then tackle the housing affordability problem, which creates a bigger problem, or we should do both at the same time, or we should only tackle the housing and the welfare and benefit system? Which is the order of it?
What do you tackle first, James? The demolition, if you like, the destruction of the welfare system, or the rebuilding of this new modern structure of in-work society? Can it be done in that sort of logical order?
I mean, this partly relates to the previous question. I think that we have seen in Britain in the last 4 years the most astonishing change in public mood, public attitudes, public acceptance of change. I mean, obviously you don't destroy the old one straight off. There are people who, for example, the most extreme example, you cannot say to somebody who's just at pension age, sorry, we've changed the system, you're not going to get your pension. That would obviously be outrageous. So there's got to be continuity. but there's also got to be change so that people in the future get much better pensions, for example. But I mean, hasn't it? I mean, you talk about getting things through. Hasn't it been extraordinary how the way that things have gone through? And part of that is language. I remember Peter Lilly talking about his little list of people who would not be missed. And he was treating people on welfare dependency. He's a great guy, I admire him enormously. He's the first person to start reform, but the language he used was hostile and derogatory. Whereas Ian Duncan Smith has been superbly brilliant, I think, in using a completely different language, coming at it very sincerely, saying this is not the way people want to live. And actually, we all, I don't know about all agree, but most of us agree on something, on the fundamentals. The fundamentals for both those on the left and on the right is we do not want people to suffer extreme poverty and be in dire straits in our modern world. On the other hand, we want them to work if they possibly can, rather than living off other people. We all agree about that. And in a way, we're making as much of an argument as we possibly can about something we actually agree about.
So, James, you have not answered my question.
I'm sure I haven't.
When are we going to tackle the housing affordability crisis?
The housing affordability, sorry, I didn't quite hear you. Okay,
Yeah.
housing affordability, when? I don't know. I mean, that does take, I mean, I think that if we get another, it's possible, let's fantasize, it's possible that we might conceivably get a Tory government next time. It's possible that they won't be hamstrung by the Liberals. It's possible that they then will put through more radical changes in the planning laws which enable councils in Britain, as councils do in Switzerland and Germany, to keep more of the profits of development and enable also the individuals who own the properties to keep the profits. If you give the incentives to people, they will react to incentives. It's happening, I mean, nobody needs to be taught this. If you give them the incentives, it'll work. And it'll be, I think this can happen. I think it could be a surprise because I think more and more of us, you're raising it, other people are raising it, people on left and right are raising it. Housing has got too expensive. I want my children to be able to live in London. At the moment, they wouldn't be able to.
May I just say, however, that it's really interesting that when you look at the figures, the London issue is quite different from the rest of the country to a really extraordinarily dangerous degree. And in the last 12 months, for example, the average price of a home in London went up by 11%, in Scotland by 0.3%, in the North East, the North West and Northern Ireland by 1%. The national average was only 3 point something. In other words, we've got a very, very badly skewed model here, where homes in London are driven, frankly, by the sclerotic nature of the planning system that we were talking about earlier. The lack of supply, when actually the land exists and the demand exists.
Yeah, the price is telling you that people want to live in London.
The price is telling you that they want to live there. Exactly.
Relocation?
Relocation, in other words, the idea of saying, look, London's getting a bit too big, push them out somewhere
Not
else.
push them out, but offer some sort of financial incentive to move to a place where unemployment is higher or where there's opportunities and that they can afford the housing more easily. You can't have this country with only one great city.
Now that's of course a subject for probably at least one, if not 2-day policy exchange event, which I should be happy to participate in. You've just opened the biggest can of worms in Britain as far as I'm concerned. Yeah, another question.
Damien Riley from PwC. The coalition introduced something called the Work Programme in the last term, which was designed to engage with people who are considered harder to help in terms of the time they've been out of work on benefits. It has delivered, at best, pretty mixed results in terms of employment outcomes, although it varies from region to region. I just was interested in the panel's reflections on what we could do differently in terms of reforming the design of that scheme. And in particular, I'm interested in Peter's view, given the American Works experience, but other panelists as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm very familiar with the work program and also its mixed results. My wife, if she were here and had talked and you had asked her that question, she sent Danny Finkelstein about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe 4 years ago, a memo on why it was going to fail. And she was absolutely right. And the major thing was the way it's structured. And it's structured to have very, very large, mostly international companies running what should be a very small, lean, entrepreneurial effort. And it should have had, like America Works, we are actually about a $35 million company, but we're not huge. We're not international. We are a company that can act very entrepreneurially. So when I talked about wage supplementation a few minutes ago, we literally, I mean, in its own way, handed our salespeople a bucket of cash and said, you go out, you talk with companies, you negotiate with those companies, and you work out wage supplementation for each of the people. And the less you have to put out, the more you can do in other companies. It was a Maximus can't do that. They don't have the ability to do that. And also, the subcontracting to the charities, most of whom are not very good at doing this job. There's no reason, there's every reason why this failed. And I think Lee got it right when she sent Dan the memo.
Can I just say, I think on behalf of charities who tried to engage with the scheme, part of the problem is if you set us extremely challenging targets and pay us at the end, you lay a cash flow strain on small third sector organisations that's impossible to bear, and then leads to us simply saying this is in the too difficult and too dangerous category, you get nowhere.
We've been in the business of work programs in the city for a long time. As I mentioned in my presentation, we pay for outcomes, which I presume they do here. I think that one of the key things that's going to come to play in the new administration is that the government was not afraid to use its tools to drive compliance with the work programs that were trying to help people. So there was a very elaborate set of communications set up, and this may be the case here, and I don't know anything about it, but whereby if the person did not comply with the requirements that were necessary in order to comply with the program being provided by the contractor reported that, and then that had an impact on their grant relatively quickly. And that, where we backed up their need to sanction clients for failure to comply, I think contributed. The other thing I should point out is that not all of the vendors, as much as I love Peter's company, they got a lot of people jobs, but the culture of the program led to people getting their own jobs. And we had a way of tracking that and reporting that. We didn't pay for it, but it's not all the case manager who makes it happen. You also have to have the philosophy and the culture that makes the person say, you know what, I don't really need this anymore. I'll just go and get my own job. And that contributed a lot to this workforce participation increase in the city of New York, as much or as what the programs actually.
Also, what Robert had and his predecessor before him, Jason Turner, was a real performance-based contracting system. And what you have here is a diluted. And why we have that kind of way of policy, developing policy around social programs, particularly employment programs, but not around delivering airplanes. If you contract, if the government contracts for 100 airplanes and you deliver 50, you get 50, you pay for 50. In our business, it's not like that.
I also, just in answer to your number of times, leadership of the contract, like someone who has the responsibility and the authority to make an adjustment to address a cash flow problem, happened in the time that I was commissioner. The vendors would come in and say, I'm pinched, this is hard, I know, and you have authority to work with your vendors to relieve those pressures. I don't know if they have that here, but we used it.
The first thing I say is that, I know you're asking about specifically the work program, but let's not forget that overall, the performance on unemployment in the last 4 years, given the really low growth, has been sensational. As it were, the ratio between the amount of growth and the employment level has been the best I've known for the last 45 years. And normally we've had stagflation, unemployment not moving up even when there's growth. This has been exceptional. In England we've had real reductions in unemployment, and that is in spite of the fact we've had a higher participation rate, as more and more lone parents and people who were previously on incapacity benefit have moved into participation. So to get lower unemployment in that situation has been a sensational performance. On the work programme specifically, I think, first of all, you've got to cut a bit of slack. The early figures were poor, but it's possible that there were teething problems, that they're learning from what mistakes made, that they're increasing incentives, tightening up on sanctions, stuff like that. And I do think my few points of contact with the programme, I haven't been in touch with it recently because I've been looking at other things, but I got the impression that things are getting better on the work programme. And as you say, these are people who are the most difficult to get into jobs, people who have been out of employment for a year. And what I've discovered in looking at other countries is that there's more and more emphasis, because it costs a bomb, of course, but the earlier you get in, the better your chances. Somebody's been unemployed for a year, it's really difficult to get a job. But in, I think it's the Netherlands, now, if you were going to losing your job, the moment you're told you're losing your job, you must notify the benefits office, because they're going to start work on you straight away. You don't wait for a year. The work starts now. And so I think we ought to, when we can afford it, we need to move more and more to starting as early as possible.
Thank you very much, James. Well, we are now back on the programme to move on to our next session. It's just, I think, fascinating that a session on reforming welfare to get cities moving, drawing those two huge issues together, proves to be enormously stimulating and interesting territory. Please join me in thanking three absolutely excellent speakers.